Okay, hello everybody. This is Cynthia Cummis from the World Resources Institute, and welcome to our webinar on our Science-Based Target Setting Manual. We have 60 minutes together today. We're going to present for about 30 minutes, or 30 to 40 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time to take your questions. And we're keeping all the participants on mute since it's a large number. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll just ask you to type your question into the chat box. And you can start doing that now and provide us with questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll answer them all at the end. So today you'll hear from me as well as my colleague Renee and my colleague Nicole from CDP. And we're going to give just a brief overview of the Science-Based Targets Initiative for those of you who are not familiar with it. Then we're going to do an overview of the manual and talk about some of the key chapters in the manual and explain our thinking and how we developed the approach that's in there, and then talk about our public comment process and how you can provide feedback on the manual. And then we'll take your questions at the end. So just for a little background, the Science-Based Targeting Manual is one product of the Science-Based Target Setting Initiative. The goal of the initiative is to raise the ambition on how companies are setting greenhouse gas reduction targets and ensure that they are in line with current climate science. Our goal is by the end of this year to have 100 companies committed to setting science-based targets, and then by 2020 have 250 companies announcing their targets. We think that 250 number is hopefully is where we need to be to really create the critical mass that will make this create a tipping point where this will become standard business practice. And we're already seeing a lot of momentum moving in that direction, and we do anticipate this will be standard practice in the next couple of years. This is an outline of a timeline with all the different key products from our initiative. So I'll just walk you through so you can see the different activities that we have going on as part of the project. The first is the SDA methodology. It's a sectoral decarbonization approach, and that is a methodology that the project developed that's to set science-based targets. It's a sector-specific methodology, and it works best for energy-intensive companies. It's just adding one other option for companies that are interested in setting science-based targets. And you'll see when we talk about the manual that there's currently 7 methodologies to set science-based targets that are currently available, and this is one of them. The first version of the method has been released, and we're now getting ready to also release an online calculation tool that has gone through a beta testing process, and now we're just finalizing it. And then the next item on here is the manual, which we'll talk in detail today about. We've just completed a draft. It's out for public comments, and we will host a series of workshops coming up in the next few weeks. And then we'll revise it, and our plan is to release the next draft in December, and then in the March-April timeframe we'll have it published. The next item is the target tracker, and that's a data visualization tool that's going to be a component of WRI's CAPE tool, and that is going to allow stakeholders to track the level of ambition of various companies' targets that are publicly available and track their progress towards these targets. And we'll have a first version of that available by the end of the year. And then the next item is the CDP questionnaire. CDP has been going through their annual process of revising their questionnaire, and you'll see in there next year new questions that relate to science-based targets, and they'll also be scoring based on level of ambition of targets. And then we also have a campaign out there called Call to Action. And that's where we're trying to encourage companies to make public commitments to set science-based targets, and WRI and the other partners, CDP and WWF, we actually do a review of these targets. And if we think these targets meet our criteria that we've developed, then we support them under our initiative and provide various opportunities for recognition. We had an event at Climate Week where a number of companies talked about their targets, and we made a first our announcement about our progress towards our goal of 100 companies by December. We have more than 60 companies already committed to setting science-based targets. We'll be having more events and announcements coming up at COP21. This is just a structure of the project. You can see here the partners, CDP, WRI, and UNGC and WWF sit on the steering committee. And then we also have a technical working group, which are just folks from the various partner organizations. And then we also have another team of folks that are a corporate engagement and outreach working group. We also, from outside of the partner organizations, we have this technical advisory group that you see on the right, and that is a group of companies, NGOs, and others with expertise and experience with setting science-based targets, and they work as advisors to our process, and they give us feedback on all our products before they go out for comment, public comment, or finalized. So the draft of the target setting manual that you're going to hear about today, that's been in development for at least 6 months now, and it has gone through review with the technical advisory group a couple times already. So again, here's some of our main activities, and today we're going to focus on talking about the target setting manual. So the purpose of the manual is to guide companies in setting a target. So it's for companies that are thinking about a new target or resetting their existing target. The manual is method neutral, so you won't see like any requirements in there. It's all guidance, and we're not prescribing any one of the methods to set a science-based target. We just help provide information such as the pros and cons of all the existing approaches that are out there. And we help a company walk through the steps to develop a target and provide what we think is best practice currently, which we know this is a new practice and it will be evolving over time, but we think the manual represents current best practice. And we want to help companies figure out what target setting method they should use based on their own company's situation, and then once they pick that method, then what do they do to calculate the target and set their target and announce the target and then move towards implementation. And in the version you've seen that's out for public comment, we have a lot of placeholders for case studies and examples, and we're currently working on those. So just to let you know, there will be a lot of those in the next version, but you don't see those right now.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. This is Renee. What I'm going to do is walk you through the outline of the manual itself. What you see here are the primary chapters. There's, of course, an introduction as well. Getting started is really about explaining the business case behind setting science-based targets. The next chapter then goes into understanding the methods, so descriptions of the individual methods, but actually also deals with categorizing and understanding the components of a science-based method, and we'll get into that today a bit. Moving from there, once you understand the methods, of course, which one would a company choose to set their science-based target, and we give a suggested process for accomplishing that task. Choosing the method then leads to determining the actual target, And then we move on to gaining internal buy-in, which I would say is more of a concurrent process throughout the entire target setting system, and then reporting, communicating, and then some suggestions for implementing strategies to help reduce your carbon emissions. The first primary chapter we have in the manual currently is making the business case. We describe and hear the different reasons and benefits of setting targets, but really pushing companies to think about setting science-based targets. Experts and with companies include driving innovation and transforming business practices, building credibility and reputation, demonstrating leadership and influencing policy, especially as we move toward a carbon-constrained world, and then saving money and increasing competitiveness. We have a quote here, and which we haven't outlined completely in the manual as of yet, but we've conducted a series of interviews with companies who have either set science-based targets or are considering setting science-based targets. And this quote in particular really speaks to the purpose of leadership and demonstrating to the broader community what setting a science-based target can provide. Now we get into the methods themselves. At this point, we have determined that science-based methods are made up of 3 primary components. The categorization we present at this point has evolved. We expect that it will potentially continue to evolve pending feedback from those of you on the phone and those of you who submit online, etc. We intend to receive feedback and continue to improve the structure, but this is our current understanding, and I believe a good first pass at describing what a science-based target setting method includes. The 3 primary components then are the emission scenario. So what is it that underlies the actual carbon budget that determines how much carbon we have to expend over the next 50 years? The level of disaggregation, so how is that carbon budget split up? And then the allocation mechanism, how do we allocate the emissions directly to individual companies? Continuing on, digging just a little bit deeper, so many of you are familiar with IPCC's assessment reports. So we have references to AR4, the 5th assessment report, and also IEA. And the reason why these emission scenarios in particular are listed, many of the methods that we'll discuss in a bit and that are explained more fully within the manual itself rely on these particular emissions scenarios. The level of disaggregation for 2050 targets in this case are described here and differ for IPCC's 4th assessment report, and that they differentiate between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, so your developed versus non-developed countries. Many of the other scenarios are global in nature, and then IEA in particular does disaggregate by sector. Once you have selected, or the methods themselves have determined which emissions scenario they're going to use to underlie the algorithms to arrive at the target, we also need to understand what sort of allocation mechanism is being used. We've described these by 3 terms: convergence, compression, and contraction, the 3 C's, if you will. Convergence we'll start off with first, and with this graph what you see is one black line that represents a particular sector. So convergence, these graphs or these projections really only apply to scenarios that have disaggregation by sector. The emissions intensity that you see on the left-hand side would be your carbon emissions per dollar value or per a physical metric. Compression looks a bit different and not sector-based in this case, and all companies within the same level of disaggregation. So likely if you're in a developing or a developed nation, then you would have the same level of disaggregation reduced at a uniform rate. Once again, for compression, we're using an emissions intensity metric, so either a physical or a value-based metric to determine your target. And lastly, this graph looks basically exactly the same, except that your axis changes in that we have absolute emissions reduction. So no longer an emissions intensity reduction, but an emissions reduction that is expressed in absolute terms. So that's the overview of how we have described the components of individual science-based methods. What we have on the screen here is sort of a summary of all of these themes brought into one chart. So the emission scenario and carbon budget. What we didn't get into directly in the webinar today, but is described more within the manual, is that there can be different trajectories, peak and decline versus linear. Moving on to the level of disaggregation, you either have a global carbon budget or you disaggregate the budget by geography and or sector. And then the allocation mechanisms that we've just described, convergence or compression, which both lead to an intensity metric, or contraction, which is really just absolute reductions. Here we've categorized the 7 methods that we currently have in the manual, the science-based target setting methods, within the 3 different components of science-based target methods. Just to give an example, and you can look into the manual to see more clearly how each of these map into these different categories. The SDA, homogeneous, for example, is a sector-based scenario and has a convergence trajectory with a physical intensity metric. 3% solution is also sector-based, but follows an absolute reduction trajectory or contraction. And to clarify what the gray bars mean is that a few of the methods actually stretch across multiple categorizations, and that they have flexibility in which emission scenarios and the level of disaggregation you can apply based on those methods. So CSO and GIVA in particular, GIVA being a value-added method, and then absolute contraction, which again would be absolute reductions. So once you've gained an understanding of the individual methods and the components of methods themselves, of course what we want to give guidance on would be how to determine which method to choose. At this point, the process is kept fairly straightforward and simple, and that we would recommend determining what your company's attributes are. And on the left, you see that this would apply particularly to your sector assignment, whether you are in a homogeneous versus heterogeneous sector, homogeneous being more commodity focused, iron and steel, cement, power generation, etc. Heterogeneous, an example would be the chemical industry, which has a very wide variety of products and processes within their individual sector. Then the geographic location and estimates on projected growth. So assessing these company attributes will then allow you to answer questions, which are on the next slide. We currently have a proposal for the questions that are seen on the screen and are also presented in the manual. The order does, at this point, start with determining sector assignment and then moving down to projected growth. A company may choose to rearrange these questions in a different way based on their individual scenario of that company. When you answer each of these questions, you'll arrive at methods options, which are on the right-hand side of the table. And through that, you will likely end up with a couple of top methods, or ones that you answered yes to more frequently than others. We would then suggest screening these top methods to model your targets. We do also understand that some companies may be in additional sectors that are homogeneous, and so therefore you may need to repeat this process again in that case. Once you've determined the top methods to model, you may end up with one or more methods that might apply to your company. Looking at the targets themselves after collecting the data and using the guidance in the manual to determine your target, we recommend at this point selecting the most conservative target, which really translates into the most ambitious target when there are more than one method that apply. Some companies we've seen through a couple of case studies have actually chosen to blend or adapt these methods to arrive at their own ambitious targets, and this is another acceptable method to determining your final target. In a couple of cases through the interviews we conducted, we also noted that companies might set targets within individual departments that they manage internally, but then roll up to a corporate target that would be externally communicated. So there could be some differentiation there as well. And I'm going to pass it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Renee. Do I have screen presenter rights?
Those should be coming from Lindsay, yes.
Once the method is set, the target should have the following recommended characteristics. The boundary of the target should cover company-wide Scope 1 and 2 emissions and the greenhouse gases in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The target year should be at least 5 years from when the target is announced and would ideally have a much longer target date, such as 2030 or 2050. Long-term targets enable companies to make plans and investments that can catalyze substantial reductions over time. If a company's Scope 3 emissions are substantial, for example, at least 40% of the total, then an ambitious target is recommended. In order to display progress towards the target, it is recommended to annually disclose the greenhouse gas inventory. And since absolute reductions are the most meaningful in terms of reducing total global atmospheric emissions, absolute targets are preferable. It is recommended to disclose absolute targets alongside any intensity-based targets. Effective communications are important and can encompass any or all stages of target setting, including why your company has set the target in the first place, base year inventory information, as models are sensitive to these data, a description of the target itself, progress being made, and any future plans. Because of the nuances of science-based target setting, it is important to make descriptions of the inventory and target as relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and accurate as possible. In the box in the top right-hand corner of the slide, you can see material that is highly relevant to science-based target setting that may not usually be communicated, such as percentage of total emissions covered, scopes and categories covered, intermediate targets, and the science-based target setting method. In addition to detailed text, large amounts of information can be communicated simply and visually using figures such as those displayed here. The infographic on the left is from Mars and covers both why setting a science-based target is important, as well as the scale of the emissions they are reducing over time, conveyed with both images and numbers. Figures such as these can inform a wide range of audiences. Additional examples are provided in the manual. Communicating targets and progress towards them allows the company to showcase its efforts and garner support from those who can help to achieve them. Internally, after gaining management approval, nearly every department in your company is a relevant stakeholder, since each can contribute to achieving your science-based targets. When drafting messaging, keep your audience and their motivations in mind and make the connection to why they would find the target relevant. With a science-based target, you can take a specific number to management and attest that it is quantified using climate science. According to a major food company, science-based targets give you a very firm basis for why it's an appropriate target. The argument then becomes whether it's an achievable or feasible target. Data can help you make your case, whether it be with cost savings, energy savings, or driving innovation and demonstrating leadership. Interpersonal skills can be equally important, as success will involve cooperation from various company departments. Once the case is made, an effective strategy will help meet the target. They can vary greatly depending on company' specific goals, starting position, costs of alternatives, and market conditions. The manual discusses the potential of various sectors. Current technologies are sufficient to meet midterm global targets, but large-scale energy transformation and land management will be required for the longer-term goals. Financing these reductions are also covered in the manual. A strategy may include internal capital that can face high hurdle rates for internal investment decisions. One strategy is to bundle projects into a portfolio that combines investments with higher and lower rates of returns or longer time horizons. Companies can also use internal carbon pricing to generate this internal capital while fostering low carbon innovation. External sources can also be found and are discussed in the manual, such as green bonds, ESCOs, or on-bill financing. The economic feasibility of strategies has been demonstrated in numerous cases. I hope this provided you with a helpful overview of the main points of the manual. Before we take questions, I'd like to go over where we are in the manual process and our timeline for completion. So far, it's been reviewed by our technical advisory group of sustainability and greenhouse gas accounting experts, as well as the authors of the various methods described. We're accepting comments from our stakeholder consultation and are holding several global workshops that will walk through the manual, which I'll describe in a minute. But after comments are integrated, a soft copy will be launched at the COP21 in Paris in early December. WRI and the ScienceBased Targets Initiative will conduct further internal review, and a final version will be released in April 2016. Public comment is open until November 16th. To facilitate discussions, we're holding workshops in Washington, D.C. on October 15th, Mumbai, India on October 20th, and Lille, France on November 5th. To register for these workshops and for instructions on submitting feedback, please visit sciencebasedtargets.org. I'd like to now open the Q&A session and hand it over to Cynthia Cummis, who will moderate.
Okay. Hi again, everybody. We're just opening up the questions, and we can start going through them. We already have a few of them, but if you have more questions, feel free to continue sending them to us. So one question is that may I confirm that the science-based target setting tool that's online is the final version? Can I use the results of the tool to set targets for my organization scope 1 and 2? I believe that the tool that's currently online is the beta version, and it's not the final version. So depending on what sector you're in, the results may change with the final tool. So I would check in with us and let us know which sector you use the tool for, and we can tell you whether we think the current version is usable or not for your purposes.
Cynthia, this is Lindsay. If I could just jump in really quick, I just wanted to let all participants know that we will be hosting a webinar on October 28th to provide a demonstration of that tool. So if you're interested, I will definitely circulate the link to register for that webinar after this session.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay, for letting everyone know. Nicole, this one would be a good one for you. It's how will CDP scoring on level of target ambition be affected by companies' science-based target methodology selection, given that various methodologies may have different outcomes?
We're currently in the process of evaluating how we're going to evaluate the various methods. We do want to make it easy for companies to I guess, we're ramping up the ambition of scoring over time, so this will be something that we're considering in the future, but companies should know that we're making it easy for them to join on at first and give them time to set these targets and go ahead and make more ambitious targets in the future. But nothing is set yet. This is currently something we're evaluating.
Thanks, Nicole.
So the next question is, how will the manual cover the setting of science-based targets? How does it work with how does the manual work with the Scope 2 reporting guidance? And can you use the market-based approach to track performance of your target? And the answer to that is that we do talk about the Scope 2 guidance in the manual, and you can use the market-based approach for meeting your target. And we do refer back to the quality criteria that are in the Scope 2 guidance, and we recommend that you only include renewable energy purchases that meet the quality criteria in meeting your target. Just because we want to assure that there's some level of quality in the products that you're purchasing. But we do have more. We are thinking carefully about this some more and seeing how the Scope 2 guidance relates to science-based target setting. So we may have some more detailed guidance about that in the future. You want to do that?
Sure. Yeah. So the next question is really pointed to whether or not companies should potentially align their methodology with national and or regional emissions reduction methodologies, where those do exist, versus potentially sector-based methodologies. We don't recommend one over the other necessarily, and that is a potential option, especially with developed versus developing countries. But we have gotten feedback from some multinational corporations that aligning targets to individual nations can be difficult given that they have a broad coverage in multiple countries, and that going by sector when feasible is a little bit more straightforward. So it's not a yes or no question. It really is what does apply best to your own company situation.
I see another question here about is the list of the 60 companies already signed up something that you can share. And if you go to our website for the initiative, ScienceBasedTargets.org, you can see a full list of all the companies that have made a commitment to set a science-based target. And you could also see the first group of companies that have announced their targets, which have been reviewed by the initiative.
I just wanted to add that they'll also be showcased on the CDP Commitment to Action website and the We Mean Business websites. So once you commit, it'll be displayed in multiple places.
Thanks, Nicole.
All right, we're just going through more of the questions. Yeah, there's one question about how is the ambition level of Scope 3 targets evaluated? Yeah, that's a very good question, because we don't have like a quantitative criteria or target setting methodology to use. We just say that if you're oh sorry, I want to reference it. So we have the project itself addresses Scope 3 in a couple different places. We have it we talk about it in the call to action and in the target setting manual. In the manual, we're really just providing guidance on and making a recommendation that you should set a science-based, or you should set an ambitious Scope 3 target if you have material emissions in your value chain. We don't really yet have a definition of what ambitious looks like, because it really depends on where your company is in thinking about Scope 3. If you already set a target, have you already done a Scope 3 inventory? Do you already have high quality data that you could even use to set a quantitative target? Sorry. But we'll put in as many examples as possible of what we think an ambitious Scope 3 target looks like.
And I think it's also important to recognize that we're really talking about companies that have a significant portion of their footprint within Scope 3 emissions. And those companies in particular would be ones that, especially under call to action, would be encouraged to set ambitious targets. But as Cynthia said, it is something that we're still trying to develop. And just one more time for clarification, under the Science-Based Targets initiative, there are multiple initiatives or projects, and the manual does not have any quote-unquote requirements. We have lots of recommendations on how to set a science-based target, The call to action, however, is different, and to commit to the call to action, there are particular requirements that need to be met. So I just want to make that clarification for when you're reviewing the manual.
And in regards to Scope 3 and the call to action requirements, we do require if 40% of your full footprint has, if more than 40% of those emissions come from Scope 3, that we do require that you have an ambitious Scope 3 target to announce along with your science-based Scope 1 and 2 target. And we are currently reviewing Scope 3 targets. So you could see we have announced about 4 targets on our website, and they have those companies have ambitious Scope 3 targets announced along with the Scope 1 and 2 targets. So that's a good place to go and get an example of what we think an ambitious Scope 3 target looks like.
And going back to a more directed question to the SDA tool itself, of whether or not, I think probably a consultant in this case could fill out the tool on behalf of the client, and I don't believe there's any restrictions for that. So please feel free, and if you need to contact someone specifically about the tool, I believe there's an email address that you can reach out to for additional questions. The next question we have here is, will food and beverage or land use be incorporated within the final SDA tool? First off, Lindsay, we have an SDA webinar coming up, don't we?
Yes, it'll be October 28th, and actually I'll put the registration link to that webinar in the chat box, so everyone should see that link in just a minute in their chat box.
But in terms of that sector being incorporated, I think there are plans to in the future, but it hasn't been developed fully yet.
There's some research currently going on with EcoFIS and Aberdeen University and others trying to map a sectoral decarbonization pathway for various food commodities, and we're hoping that the results of that research will be helpful for us in incorporating that sector, food and bev and land use, into the SDA.
The next question is, what method would you recommend for international companies with absolute targets, absolute contraction? Well, again, we're not trying to recommend a particular method. However, if you want to set an absolute target, which is something that we highly encourage, then using absolute contraction, using one of the emission scenarios, probably AR5, then that would be a good choice.
So there's a question about how does the methodology factor in competition and also the nature of business up and downs due to market volatility. So yeah, as we mentioned, we're not recommending any particular methodologies. There's 7 different methods that you can use, and they incorporate like business growth and competition in different ways. In the FDA methodology, for example, it's based on these IEA sectoral pathways, and those pathways do take into consideration what the sector's ability to reduce emissions, and it provides these an intensity metric for setting your target, and so that metric allows you, by setting an intensity-based target, it does allow you, the company.
And I think in addition to the sectoral SDA, the 3 or 4 of the other methods are value-added based, and so do take into account potential growth or shrinkage of a company based on using those methods, which I think goes back to why we're really encouraging absolute reductions, to make sure that there are real reductions in emissions ultimately. But a lot of the methods allow for the volatility of growth or shrinkage of a company. And you can go back to the chart. I want to say, I don't forget which slide, but it's definitely in chapter 3. So if you go into the manual where we lay out how the different methods map to the components of a method, you can see which ones are value-added based.
So this is a very
detailed question.
Yeah. do you have a sense of how much an oil refinery would need to reduce its 5 million tons of CO2e per year? 5%, 30%, 95%? And that's hard to say that right off the bat without running the numbers through one of the methods, and the methods really are looking at corporate level rather than a facility specific. But we could say that it's generally the methods are going to get you a result that's at an absolute level would require an improvement closer to, to at least closer to 3% reductions per year.
Just scroll down, sorry. Does this initiative apply only for large companies? I would say we would encourage all companies to join the initiative and to set science-based targets. So no, it's not large company specific. How does the manual work with LCA guide standards such as ISO 14040 or PEF, the product environmental footprint? Really only in the sense of when we're dealing with Scope 3 emissions would I say that there'd be an overlap of inventories based on data and processes provided within a more product-focused and supply chain-focused assessment. The manual really and the science-based methods primarily touch on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, so there's not a great deal of overlap for the product side, but for Scope 3 emissions there would be.
Right.
Anything to
No,
add?
yeah, just that we see Scope 3 as a compilation of like all your product LCAs plus emissions from additional Scope 3 categories like business travel and employee commuting. So any LCA data that you have is very useful for thinking about your Scope 3 targets and identifying your hotspots and figuring out where your best opportunities are for reductions. One question is just, can you provide some examples of companies that have set science-based targets? And I just encourage you to look at our website, and you'll see examples there, and other examples of companies that have been some of the first companies to set science-based targets are Autodesk, Mars Corporation, BT. Some of the ones we just announced are Coca-Cola, General Mills, Mars Corporation.
Procter & Gamble, L'Oreal, Renault, NRG, Marks & Spencer.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah.
What someone would like to know is whether their company could use the tools, and there are more tools than just the SDA available. If you look in the manual, there's links to some of these other tools as well on the website if you belong to other industry. So likely, if you're in another industry than what one is noted within SDA in particular, you may want to consider using a different methodology because they would be more prone to give you a target that is based on non-sector specific emissions trajectory. So if it's another industry, that means we probably don't have the data within SDA to match up to that sector at this point.
There's one question. Does the initiative need to review the science-based targets set by a company before a company announces these? So if the company wants to be part of our call to action and have us do a review of your target and then get recognized under the call to action initiative, then yes, we do need to review it. If you just want to use the manual as a guide in helping you think through how to set a science-based target, then there's no need for us to do any review. The review's only needed if you want recognition through the call to action.
I'd like to add that companies have the option to submit their targets for an unofficial check if they'd like to see whether or not they qualify before actually committing. And through our initiative, a company can commit to set a science-based target and have 24 months before actually having to set the target itself.
Right, yeah, thanks. That's helpful, Nicole. And then, yeah, and also just in terms of the review, what we do is just look at all our call to action criteria, and we just ensure that the target meets those criteria.
I'm just looking at the questions again. Can you tell? Whoa, sorry. More people are asking questions. Hold on 1 second. You want to go back to the Road to Paris?
Companies committing to science-based targets through the Road to Paris channels are equally treated as those who submitted commitment letter, science-based target commitment letter. Nicole, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So the Road to Paris campaign, which is now called the Meeting Business Commitment to Action campaign, because we're now looking past Paris, many companies signed on to that before our eligibility criteria were set. So if you have signed on to that, it's not an automatic commitment to our initiative. Our initiative does have the additional eligibility criteria, which are the recommendations that I went over earlier. So a commitment to one is basically a commitment to the other, but you're allowed to opt out of either if you'd like.
There's one question about whether any fossil energy companies are considering signing on to your initiative. And while we have talked to a few of them, I don't believe any have signed on yet, but we would love to see some of them participate. Nicole, can you remember if any have signed on through the Road to Paris?
Not off the top of my head, sorry.
Yeah, I don't believe we have any, but I would encourage you to check the list on the Science-Based Targets website.
Will an online tool be available for each of the 7 methodologies? Currently, no. The methods, we have not developed those methods. So there are authors of those methods, and some of those authors have chosen to create a tool, and some have not, and which is completely fine. It doesn't mean the method is better or worse because it has a tool associated with it. But you can see which ones do have tools available within the manual.
So I see a question about offsets. Are offsets a way to meet targets, an acceptable way to meet targets? And you'll see in the manual, we discourage companies from using offsets. We don't see offsets really fitting in under the philosophy of a science-based target where you're allocating your share of emissions down to a company, since the offsets take place outside of any company boundary. We do understand that there can be some really good value from investing in an offset, but we think generally you're going to get more value from investing in a reduction project within your operations or within your value chain. So it may not be within your corporate boundary, but there's lots of opportunities to collaborate with your suppliers and drive reductions within your value chain, which will be a more appropriate way to meet a science-based target.
Then we have another question related to call to action, which is more than WRI's initiative. It really is the Science-Based Targets Initiative's call to action. So if you go to the ScienceBasedTarget.org website, there are links within the website that specifically describe and allow you to explore the call to action and potentially submit commitment letters. Looking to see if we've missed any questions.
Yeah, I think we've missed a few. What if? There's a question about how would deforestation policies be incorporated into mitigation strategies to meet science-based targets. I believe if a deforestation policy or strategy is going to drive greenhouse gas reductions, then or sequestration, then they should be able to be counted towards your target. But I don't think that there's any other connection that I can think of right now. There's one question that says, should we use the SDA method for other industry?
So I think maybe we didn't answer that clearly enough.
I would say, yeah, we do recommend the use of the other industry category for companies that don't neatly fit into the other sectors.
But there are other methods as well that might suit and provide a target. So yes, you can use it, and sorry for not being clear, the SDA method for other industries, but you may also want to explore by answering the questions in the choosing the method chapter, other methods that might also apply and result in a target for your company.
And just so you know, the other industry category in the SDA treats companies and the reduction pathway in a different way than the other sectors are treated, and it does derive for you an absolute target rather than an intensity target.
I'm going to scroll back down again and see if we have more questions. I think we're nearing the end of our hour. We have for follow-up questions, can we email you? Absolutely. I think the info is probably the best email to reach us, which should be on the slide, the last slide that we're showing. info@ScienceBasedTargets.org. Yeah, it's on the Q&A one. And then, could you repeat where the actual examples of approved targets can be seen?
And that's at ScienceBasedTargets.org.
We mentioned the targets themselves in the press release that we recently distributed, and so I will put the web link to that press release in the chat box for everybody in just a minute.
Great. And there's a question, I think, which is really important about the manual itself. We've talked a lot about choosing methods and determining which method might be best, which is sort of down the weeds of the discussion and what we're sort of heading towards at this point. But in terms of the public comment process, we really do encourage people to submit their feedback. If you go on to, yet again, ScienceBasedTargets.org and go to the public draft of the manual, there is the link for a survey where you can submit detailed comments on individual chapters. And that's where we will be collecting all the feedback we can get on the manual, and that survey will be open until November 16th.
And we would also encourage you to come to our workshops if you're based in the U.S. or in Europe or in India to give us some in-person feedback, and we'll have much more time there for discussion of the manual and recommendations on approaches to use to set a target. And look forward to getting your written comments if you can't participate in person.
And lastly, about whether or not there will be support available for companies who have made a commitment to use a science-based target and
through future years to ensure that the chosen methodology is being correctly applied. We're still thinking about through the long-term strategy for the project. What we will be doing long-term, though, is at a minimum is tracking companies' performance towards their targets through the Target Tracker online tool. I think we're about out of time right now, so we apologize. I know there's a few questions we didn't get to. If people still would have a burning desire to get an answer to their question, feel free to email us and or call us, and we're happy to have a conversation with you.
Thank you for your participation today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and hope to see some of you at our upcoming workshops.
Thanks, everyone. Hope this was helpful.